Can you guys hear us? I don't think they can hear us either.
I just heard that.
Oh, you can?
Yes.
And we can hear you now too. Awesome. Thank you.
Hello?
Okay, can you guys hear us now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so
That is interesting.
so you're on a cell phone right now, so sorry about that.
No, you're good.
I'll try to stay close to it. Okay. Here.
Here, you need that.
Talking. I'm Jared's talking.
Yeah.
Shit.
So you just get to look at my name the whole
All
time.
right,
Sorry.
that's good. It works.
Whatever.
Yeah, we probably have to- Okay. Good, right? Okay, well, thank you for your patience. So a few things to keep in mind as we get going. I was mentioning that you have a packet like this. Every single slide that you'll look at here is not reflected in this. Just a place for you to take some notes if you choose to, and a reminder of a few of the key elements of the material that we'll be going through. So, in the interest of saving paper, we didn't put every single one of the 45 slides in the document. So, just a reminder to try to stay present, undistracted. Feel free to share experiences, share stories. I'll share some of them. And we also want to appreciate people's rights to confidentiality. Sometimes people share things that they don't want shared outside of these rooms. And there'll be a couple of times when I ask you to work in pairs, so you'll have an opportunity to chat with each other. So this, making sure I'm not skipping any slides here, is what we'll be doing. I'll get this down, that might help. This is kind of our roadmap for the day. We'll talk about what being an inclusive leader is and look at 4 phases of inclusive leadership. We'll illuminate by talking about 5 keystones of inclusive leader behavior. We'll embrace by talking about the mindsets that it takes to do those things effectively. We'll explore, and that will take a look at a couple of situations and how we might deal with those in an inclusive way. And then we'll end with some reflections about, what now, what next, right? So how we might kind of carry this forth beyond today. So this is who an inclusive leader is. An inclusive leader is someone who notices, right, and addresses things that maybe aren't going the way they should go. Someone who's dedicated to making sure everyone is able to be heard and have their voice and be respected in that. It's also an environment, someone who fosters an environment where people can speak up about what's important to them and do that. We call it a safe space, right? Where the workplace is a safe space to say, no, I don't think we should do that. And here's why. Hey, I need to stand up for this group. And this is why I think this is important. Removing obstacles so everyone can reach their full potential and perform at their optimal level. And also where there's an opportunity to learn. We'll talk a lot about those 4 phases of the inclusive leader. And that will include learning about different people, about different cultures, about different experiences and opportunities. We'll also talk about being curious and what we can say and do to kind of facilitate that learning. So I'll also mention here that an inclusive leader is not a person who manages other people. In this context, a leader is anyone who is responsible for something, even if that something is yourself, right? You're responsible for at least that. And anyone who has influence. So you have the opportunity with your behaviors and words to be a person of influence. So that's what we mean by leader. So you are all leaders, regardless of your role, regardless of your responsibilities. When we do classes like this with high school and college students, they are leaders. We refer to them as leaders, right? So we want to be in the mindset that you always are responsible for yourself, your control of yourself, and you have an opportunity to influence others, right? So we want to kind of move forward in that way. So that's what who an inclusive leader is. Almost getting the hang of it. An inclusive leader, this is what an inclusive leader does. An inclusive leader, so if you're a note taker, these are 3 words you might jot down on the bottom of page 1. Awareness, mindset, and skill set. An inclusive leader is someone who is aware of barriers that might prevent certain team members from feeling like they really have a place, a voice, feeling like they have an advocate, someone who's going to be aware of the need to move towards action and advocacy. We'll talk about the mindset. We'll talk about 3 core mindsets and then some of the behaviors that go along with an inclusive leader mindset, and then how you can hone those skills so that you're deliberate about the things that you do and say, particularly in the workplace. So this is the image you'll see on that first page of your packet. So we've talked a little bit about what an inclusive leader, who an inclusive leader is, what they do, and this kind of demonstrates why they do it, right? The business impact. Sure, it's nice to be nice, as my grandmother always said. It's nice to be nice, but there are some real business implications and business impacts. So this data comes from a book called The Inclusive Leader Continuum by Jennifer Brown. And she approached hundreds of different companies and tens of thousands of their customers, employees, leaders, and asked questions about job satisfaction, customer satisfaction, overall profitability, and found that an environment that lives by some of the skill sets and mindsets that we'll talk about tend to reap the benefits of that. Now, looking at this, which of these do you think is most impactful or most important to you? And there are no wrong answers, so feel free to share. Of these 5 things.
Customer satisfaction.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. Customer satisfaction. Any other thoughts about which of these is important?
Yeah, greater productivity, because that's the story of feeling yourself worth.
Yeah, and I like to think that they all kind of tie into each other, right? When employees are more productive and customers are happier and keep coming back as return customers, we see higher revenues, we see higher profit margins. So some of them kind of build on each other or influence each other. If we're able to lower our turnover, or bad turnover as we call it in HR, then people are more productive because they're here longer and able to get to a point where they're doing their jobs effectively, and we're not constantly training new people. So if we can keep the people we want to keep good folks, then that affects productivity, which affects profitability and so forth. So again, there's more than just being nice to each other, although that's important. There's some benefits to that, but there's some business benefits to this as well. Okay, so I mentioned already that there are 4 phases of the inclusive leader. So again, this definition isn't in your packet, but there are some key words that I think are pretty important. The 4 of the 4 phases, it's a framework or kind of a process or a guideline for leaders to follow. And they are following that framework to identify strengths and areas of weakness. What areas could you learn more about? What areas are you maybe unaware? What phase are you with different areas? So that is about your own knowledge and self-awareness. And all of that helps you to take meaningful steps toward, again, being that inclusive leader, that leader that promotes other people's productivity and performance, a person who's treating others in a welcoming way, a leader who is curious about others, but also candid about their own values. We'll talk about candid and curious a little later as well. So when we use the framework and are aware of which of the 4 phases we are in, we're able to identify our strengths and weaknesses and move forward with actions. Keep our strengths strong, but then also, work on those areas where we realize we have to work. So being unaware, I think you'll see this on page 2. Yeah. So the inclusive leader continuum defines unawareness this way. You think diversity is just about compliance, staying out of trouble, avoiding, lawsuits or things like that, staying out of the principal's office, so to speak. And it's someone else's job to make sure we are diverse and inclusive. Not necessarily everyone's job, just someone's job. That's what being unaware looks like. As you move into awareness, you realize that you have a role in educating yourself, maybe at times educating others about differences in the workplace, about different cultures, about different demographics. And I'll also add that this is not necessarily linear, right? You may be unaware in some areas, aware in other areas. You may be active in a different area. But I will say that awareness and unawareness are generally considered private. People won't know unless you say, right? Unless you say, oh, I've never, worked with an Indian person before. No one will necessarily know that. It's low risk because it's private. Nobody knows, so it doesn't require you to do anything. It's just the knowledge that you have within you. So that makes it an individual perspective. When we get into action and then into advocacy, those are higher risk because it requires you to do something, say something, change something, maybe even ask someone else to change something. Given the time we have, we won't talk a lot about advocacy today, but we will talk some about the active phase, which is making that shift in priority so that inclusion and diversity is a priority, not just an afterthought, or again, not just something that HR is responsible for or managers and people leaders are responsible for. So I mentioned that you could be aware in some areas and unaware in other areas. So I'll kind of give you an example. Let's say you have worked a lot with working moms. So you are aware of the needs and differences that they might bring into the workplace, how their needs might be different than yours, and how that might look, how you might be able to support them given those needs and preferences. So you might be unaware in that area. But let's say a new team member joins and that team member is on the autism spectrum, and you've never worked with someone with that different ability and that different way of socializing before. So you might be a lot less aware of what their needs and preferences are, how you can support them so that they are optimally performing in the workplace, so that they can bring their strengths, their gifts and talents forward without that being stifled or dismissed, without assumption, without judgment. So again, you could be completely unaware in some areas and very aware and even active or advocating in other areas. So it's not linear. You'll be moving all around these 4 phases, and that's okay. Let's go back here. So unaware was the first phase. What are issues can you think of that could arise if a person stays in that unaware phase?
Just saying the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You don't know them that well, and like the autistic person you talked about. You don't
Right.
deal with that on a daily basis, you might say the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Incorrectly judge their performance.
Mm-hmm.
That's not aware.
Absolutely. And that's a good point, because one of the things I mentioned that an inclusive leader does is makes it okay. Where create the environment where it's okay to talk about who you are and kind of bring your whole self to work. So that means a person who, so to stick with the autism example, or even someone who's maybe dyslexic, should be able to say, hey, this is how I'm different. And so that means this might take me a little longer. I might be less talkative in team meetings, just kind of having that space where they can share that without us thinking, oh, they're not going to perform well. Oh, why did we hire them? They're not as good as someone who doesn't have that difference. So where they can just kind of share that and know that the people around them will be supportive of that. So yeah, as you said, we might say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, not take them seriously, not give them opportunities. Oh, they probably wouldn't be good at leading that team because they are this or that or the other. So just being aware of that and not limiting that person's potential and performance. That's what could happen if we stick with awareness. So how do you think someone could progress from unaware to aware? How do you think we can kind of make progress?
Ask questions.
Ask questions. That's number one on my list. Yep. Ask questions. What else?
Well, if you're gonna ask questions, then you need to make them feel like it would not be an issue to talk to you about their particular concerns or their particular personal issue.
That's absolutely right, Steve. So do any of you have kids? So have any of those kids, are they now, or any of those kids have ever been teenagers?
No,
Okay, so what was done with me and what I did with mine was that I would say, you can talk to me about anything. Yeah, but that's not always the case. And quite frankly, there are a lot of things I don't really want to know. But to your point, when you start asking questions and when you welcome someone to talk openly to you, you have to be prepared for what they're going to give you and give them, the respect and understanding that they need. Now, that doesn't mean that we're always breaking all the rules to accommodate, one person. There's something in HR that we call reasonable accommodation, right? So it does mean that if we have the ability to adjust, and we can always adjust our language and our behavior, it doesn't mean we're adjusting every policy or every rule or doesn't mean we're, changing the core of the organization and how we function. Again, it may just be behavioral mindset, language, and how we need to adjust that. So I'll tell you a story that I heard in one of these sessions once. There was a team, and they would often use the word retard, just in their kind of everyday joking around with each other. You're such a retard. That's so gay. That's another thing they would often say. So without knowing it, they were alienating people that have certain intellectual differences or disabilities, or people who are gay, right? Because of the language they were using. And they didn't know it. And of course, those people who were of that demographic didn't feel comfortable saying, hey, that's me you're talking about. Please don't use that language. That's not always comfortable for people to do. So we have to be careful of kind of putting the onus on the other person. Oh, they should have told me, I didn't know. And just being more aware of the impact we're having and what we're saying and how that might be impacting others. Because as I mentioned, when you're impacting others, you're not just impacting whether or not they're happy or sad. It's not really your job to make other people happy. However, if you're doing things and saying things that are kind of creating a stifling environment, I won't say hostile, that's a bit much, although it does happen. But an environment where people don't feel like they can be themselves, they don't feel like they can talk openly and share things about their lives, or even ask for what they need, then they're probably not going to perform at their highest level. And if they feel like they're working in a place where they're not really important or valued or respected, why would they work at their highest level? Why would they go above and beyond, give, discretionary effort, and share all of their greatness if that's not going to be noticed, much less rewarded? So those are all things we want to keep in mind as we move to these keystones. So we've introduced Inclusive Leader, who it is, what they do, why they do it, those business impacts. That includes the 4 phases. So we'll look at 5 keystones. So that kind of gets us into some behaviors of the Inclusive Leader. Those are on the next page of your little handout there. Back at the time. So the Inclusive Leader keystones are what we'll start talking about. So I've mentioned a few times about language and its importance. Again, that's an easier thing to adjust. I mentioned it's not necessarily about turning the company upside down and making huge monumental changes. Sometimes just the way we greet somebody and when we see them in the hallway can make a difference for them. So you'll see it's defined as understanding why inclusive language matters and knowing what that kind of looks like. So we're not really prescribing language. So we won't really talk about what to say and what not to say. Because we don't want you to feel like before you greet someone, you need to go check the rule book and see if it's okay to say it, right? But just to be of the right mindset so that you're at least considering the things that you're saying before you say them, because that's when you can actually do something about it. So we'll talk a little bit about language. We'll talk some about prioritizing inclusion. And that means that inclusivity won't just be an afterthought. It will be something that you consider in advance. And a lot of times that is asking the right questions. So we'll do a little activity shortly where we talk about some of those questions. Then there is embracing change. And that's kind of being a champion for change. When you see something that needs to be adjusted, needs to be changed for the greater good, then, just kind of saying something about it. Like maybe you don't even have the power and authority to change it, but bringing it to someone's attention is what embracing change is about. Now, if you think about those 4 phases, that might be moving us into action and even into advocacy, because at that point you're kind of standing up for something that you don't think is working well and seeking that change. Awareness of intent versus impact. So, acknowledging that the intent may be different than the way it landed, right? The impact that it had. So if you find yourself saying things like, I didn't mean it that way. You took it the wrong way. I didn't mean to offend you. I didn't mean to embarrass you. Things of that nature. That demonstrates that what you meant and what you said or did are kind of out of alignment. And so again, it's just the awareness of that. If our language and behavior isn't really landing on folks the way we wanted it to, then maybe there's an opportunity to adjust some things. And then the last one, the 5th, is bias awareness, working to uncover and understand. Well, really kind of starts with your own biases. And we all have them. Biases are innate, right? So we are either born with them or taught very early certain things. And they exist innately to keep us safe, keep us free from harm. So we learned very early not to walk alone in a dark alley that could be unsafe. You know, we learn to stay away from certain things and to do certain other things. Stay away from things, people, environments that may cause us harm or seem unsafe, right? So that would be considered a bias, something that we believe about a certain thing or person. But then the issue with biases becomes when it affects how we treat people, particularly in the workplace, in a way that they haven't really earned, right? In a way that's unfair and not really based on their own behavior or any interaction that we've had with them. And so I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example of from the book, The Inclusive Leader Continuum. And it's a story about a guy named Daniel, an African-American man who moved from Atlanta to a very tiny town in the Midwest to take a job there. He was offered a job, so he went. So his new boss realized that he would be the only Black person in the company. She also realized that he was moving from a much larger city where things were very different, where he had lots of conveniences and lots of social things that he could do and all of that. So she was aware of that. She was also aware that people in the workplace had not necessarily lived around, been around, worked around people that looked like Daniel. So she started out before Daniel even arrived, kind of setting the tone for what she expected from her team. And then let them have an opportunity to talk about, you know, what they expected as well. When Daniel arrived for his first day of work, she did the same thing with him. She talked to him about expectations and then gave him an opportunity to say what he expected or what might help him to flourish and really, you know, perform at his highest level there. And so when she asked him, Daniel, you know, was able to talk about things like, you know, making decisions together as a team whenever that's appropriate. It's not always appropriate, but making sure that everyone was included when certain decisions were made. Making sure that decisions were made in the work environment instead of out of the work environment. Because what Daniel had experienced at other places were that sometimes decisions were made when a small group of people were on the golf course or at dinner or lunch or happy hour, and everyone didn't get to be included because everyone wasn't there. So certain choice assignments and even just having some input into certain things was happening with a small subset of the organization, but not with a bigger group who should very well have a stake in certain things. So those are the kinds of things he asked for. But because his boss was aware of some of the biases that might exist in the organization and how they might impact Daniel, she kind of wanted to get ahead of that and be proactive. And so that's what we're really talking about and looking for when we talk about biases. Uncovering them, that's the first piece, but then coming up with those strategies that can help to overcome them. Not just noticing that they're there, but figuring out, okay, so what do we do next? What do we do with that bias? Okay. So I've shared some things about bias. What's the other one? And some things about awareness versus intent. So I will ask you all to work with these other three. So I will give you an assignment. So you're working a little group of 2 or 3, I guess. And you'll either be talking about language or prioritizing inclusion, or embracing change. And you'll just be asking these questions. So say, for example, if your group is assigned to talk about language, one of the things that you'll be discussing and deciding with each other is something you can do to demonstrate inclusivity. Well, something you can say, because that's about language, right? And maybe something that you should stop saying if there's anything. If you are going to be talking about prioritizing inclusion, what questions should you ask? We said that one of the things that you can do to make sure that you're prioritizing inclusion is to ask questions. So what would be some of those questions that you need to ask? Things you need to consider, things you need to talk about to make sure that inclusion is staying at the forefront. And then if your group is going to be talking about embracing change, talk about a situation where you might need to speak up for something or someone, or stand up for something or someone. What situation could come up? Maybe it's never come up, but what kind of situation could come up where it would be important to stand up for something, stand up for someone, to make sure that, again, there's fairness and equity and all of those things. So I'll come back to those on the phone. I'll ask this little group of three to work on prioritizing inclusion. Language for you two. You
Okay.
guys can do it, work together.
Mhm.
And then embracing change. Change language. Prioritizing inclusion. And language. Are y'all working on? We can work on that.
I don't.
Three and three.
I don't think it's the rest.
Yeah.
So then you have to work on prioritizing inclusion. But you gotta be.
Organization.
Sorry, buddy.
And so that's it. Focus on the All right, folks on the phone. If you could work on language, something that you should start saying or stop saying that would make the workplace more inclusive. You can take your notes on page 3. And if you care to, you can share in the chat as well.
Doesn't help if I can't can't see it. If you send me a text about that.
If you're taking notes, you can do that on page 3.
It's hard to recognize. So it makes it try to make it
See someone struggling, zeroing in on not intentional.
what you ask too.
Yeah. So like, I would say. Or something like that. But I would have to recognize them. Otherwise. I think I've thought about it. Yeah. I guess that's the first thing.
I've always, we normally do this, but it has to. It puts stuff in. Oh, wow. And I find a way that I like better than. I mean, it's one of those together.
I think I've always. Oh, better just a train. Without actually. No, that's a it's just gotta be.
Right away.
And it's also. We can say that, but I think that's where the challenge is. Gotta catch yourself. But you don't know. It's better to do it.
About. Five concepts.
We always joke. In mine, I never had to feel the same go.
Five concepts.
Maybe even just knowing there.
Reader account. Embrace them.
It's not only what you say, but how you do it. It's because it's like right. We gotta, but, you know, once they've kind of got that feeling, then it's hard to really unpick that thing.
Anyway.
Well, I'd say. She's taking the notes for us.
That's awesome.
I think just. Be able to put words.
We'll give it about 1 more minute. Yeah.
Well, no, that's good. I was thinking is, changes, asking.
Right, just forward.
You're skipping ahead on what we came up with. You already come up with that? Something very, no, something very simple. Yeah, which.
All right, everyone, are we ready to regroup? All right. So which groups we're talking about language? Okay. So it looks that way. I didn't do that on purpose.
Okay. One of the things that David and I were talking about, and he brought this, you said this, and I thought this is one of the most non-inclusive things to say to somebody that just started. This is how we do things here.
Ah, yeah.
You know, and because we started off saying, what can we do? You know, what can we do to make you successful? What
Right.
tools can we provide you to make you successful?
Right.
It kind of gets kind of a welcome type greeting to the new staff member.
Pretty good.
And but then he brought up, this is how we do things here. I have heard that before in this
Mhm.
office. And it's not welcome at all.
Yeah, and it can sound as if we're not open to new ideas. We're not open to suggestions. We've already decided how things are going to be done, and that's the only way they can ever be done. Which means we don't have opportunities to improve as an organization, right? We're kind of shutting that off when we say that. Those are good examples. Thank you. I think there was another group. Okay, tell me about it.
We were mostly talking about how there's two things. If someone doesn't feel comfortable with like standing up for themselves and saying, would you not please talk about that or say that term to be that person to stand up for them, kind of include them in the process.
Yeah,
And then also the meaning of certain words changes over time. So just kind of
Ooh.
clarifying the meaning of those phrases and terms you use in your regular lingo.
absolutely. And that makes me think just about, just really everyday language. So I do a lot of work with companies that kind of have a global reach. And so when I am in a room, even a virtual room with people that are from Thailand and India and Japan and China and Europe and the US, I'm careful about just some of the language that I use. I don't pull out my old Tennessee, bless your heart. I don't, because that doesn't have any meaning at all in certain places. And in some places, it has a negative connotation, right? It's kind of an insult. Who knew? So I just, I'm careful about that. Even when we say things like, okay, now we're just beating a dead horse. To some people, that does not, like they're picturing in their mind a horse being beaten to death, right? It doesn't have, let's get the ball rolling. That doesn't mean anything to some people. So we just have to be careful about, even about those adages and colloquialisms that we just kind of use very innocently that may not really resonate at all with someone. They have no idea. And it can be uncomfortable being the only person in a large group that says, I have no idea what we're talking about. Please help me, right? That can be tough. So I'm glad you brought that up. I think you guys talked about, no, you didn't talk about language. What did you talk
Prioritizing inclusion.
about? Okay, let's do it.
Got it, babe. Introduction, here's page.
Nice.
Well, anyway, asking questions, of course, the more you can find out about them without being invasive of your privacy or anything,
Yes.
then the more you can help them or people can respond to them better. So some of the things we thought about are, where are they from? Can they tell us a little bit about where they're coming from,
Nice.
where they've lived?
Mhm.
And what are their strengths? What do you think that you're really good at? Because we've talked about that here before, is sometimes we have people that they're really artistic, but we're not letting them do anything artistic. We could be, using that
Yeah.
skill.
Yep.
And some people want to be artistic and they would like to develop it and use it. And so we could, work with somebody that's artistic and them, and they could teach them, I guess, some training too. So another thing is, what training do you think you need to do your job better?
That's great.
Get you like, I don't know how to type. If I could type, I know how to write so much stuff. I can
Right.
save a whole lot of time if I just
Yeah.
get, and maybe work that out. Or,
Oh.
the CAD programs, things like that. Maybe somebody could need a little bit of training to get up to speed on that.
Mhm.
Do the job better. Ask what their hobbies are, because that tells you a lot about people, and then it gives you something to talk about. Besides the weather.
Yep. Right.
And
The traffic.
and what are their goals? What's their life ambition? Where do they want to be and grow? And then
I love it.
also the staff to talk to them about, try to make this person feel welcome here and include them in things, just some general things. Just because they're new, don't overlook them and make them have to do the work to get involved in things, to sort of invite them to different activities.
Yeah.
Involve them in different, we do a particular building, make sure we got invite them even if they don't need to be invited for that. And the more we
Great
get
ideas.
interact with them, the more we understand.
Those are great ideas. Thank you for sharing those. Very nicely said. Yeah, I, worked in an environment once, probably only once, where my boss actually came up to me one day and said, hey, we were in a manager's meeting last night and we were talking about this new writing project. And I know you told me a long time ago that you enjoy creative writing. And so we thought that you would be a good fit for this role. And it made me feel great that one, she remembered that. She was thinking about me even when I wasn't there and thinking about what would be a good fit, what would be meaningful, challenging, and interesting for me in my career. And it just made me want to work harder for her and make her proud and, do the best I possibly could. And she was that way with everyone, that reported to her, so much so that when she left that organization, 3/4 of her team left too. And a few of them went where she went. And the rest just left. They're like, no, anything less is no longer acceptable, right? They just couldn't fathom not having that kind of inclusive leader in their life. So it is very impactful and kind of goes back to what we talked about before. We want to lower turnover. We want greater productivity, higher performance, customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, right? And we can get that with the kinds of stuff you've been sharing. Who else talked about inclusion, prioritizing inclusion? Y'all? Okay.
So similar to what Paige was saying, we said language is always one of those norms that can be challenged and that we can always grow with more education and awareness. And I think you touched on that too. And I love that you said, the simplest thing can mean something completely different to someone else. So, but to Paige, to your all's point, just making sure that you get to know someone on a personal level. You get to know their passions. We talk a lot about trying to find that passion that people enjoy, because again, it does help, with their production and make them enjoy the job. But it helps us to learn how to better communicate with each other too. In doing that, and you get to understand, people's backgrounds or their family or, certain beliefs that they have. And again, it just builds that team, that the working relationship. And then I was also sharing with Jared and Anthony, something that I've become very more aware of is just this whole like seat at the table. I've watched several videos on that, and it's not just from a female's perspective, but it's just about trying to include everyone, and giving them the opportunity to be involved, for their voice to be heard. And I think that's so important and something that we all need to continue to focus on more.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard someone say recently that everybody in the work environment needs a seat at that table, but it also needs to be a comfortable seat where I can feel, comfortable. It's actually okay for me to say, hey, that's not right, or let's try this, or whatever, and not think that there's going to be some sort of retaliation or problem, long term, because maybe I shared a perspective that's different than the majority. And I also, like you said about families, getting to know people's families, or at least welcoming them to talk about that and share that. As we've been talking about, you have to be kind of prepared that their family structure might be different than yours. So is it going to be okay making sure it's okay for the woman who's married to a woman and has 2 adopted kids to have that picture of her family on her desk, just like everybody else has theirs, and knowing that is a cherished part of her world, and treating it that way, just the way you feel about your family. So again, being when we do start to be curious, we have to be particularly mindful of biases and judgments and other things that that might creep in. So great ideas. Thanks, Beth. Who else talked about inclusion? Okay, tell me what you got.
Yes, we mostly just talked about how asking questions, follow-up questions around issues that happen around the office, or meetings, things like that are really important, and kind of asking the right questions. So like, if you said something about like, oh, what did you get out of that meeting? Make sure that they got what they needed. And if they didn't, kind of helping them to find what they needed. I think something that was also very helpful was being encouraged to ask questions. So like, regarding time when to be active, seek out what I wanted. So it's
Yeah, and I like that idea too, because people may not always know what you need. So being, making sure that the environment is welcoming for you to ask questions and be curious, because that's really what we're talking about. Okay, what about embracing change? Is that anything else? Okay.
We actually went a wide array of stuff
Good.
to talk about.
like a wide array.
From a simple standpoint with, situations where you should speak up, through your jokes or things like that, that may or may not be appropriate, or your language may or may not be appropriate. Those are pretty straightforward, but can also be difficult to understand when someone may or may not be offended. And then we also actually took sort of a designer's approach to it and talked a little bit how, as designers, what we can do change, like with accessibility or gender neutral bathrooms, things like that that are part of the common, not necessarily workplace, but just society in general now. And both what the benefits and the potential issues are, and how us as designers can help understand the pros and cons of those to make the right decision. And part of that is we're seeing it more and more, but there could be situations where there's safety hazards with potential, common bathrooms and shared lavatory or sink locations, especially in schools. I'm going to give an example about third grade location of second grade girl into a bathroom, all being in the same location. So what we can do as designers to help facilitate that sharing
That's good, because you're bringing it kind of full circle to the actual work that you do and how you might be able to serve your clients better, and at least open up the conversation about their needs and things that things to consider in your design work. Good. I like it. Okay. So I think that is all of those items. So yeah, oh, do you guys, did I skip you guys? I don't want to. I got the hearing of an elephant.
I'm embracing change.
Okay, okay,
And after
I'll go with
Martin's-
that.
After Martin's talk, I feel bad about suppressing my cohort over here. So why don't you tell them yourself?
Oh, wow, yeah.
So physical barriers was embracing change, and there's a chair between us, so we moved the chair.
Well, that's important. That's
Then we
important.
looked at a handicapped person who might be coming new into the company.
Mhm.
And we started thinking, well, downstairs, is there a button on the outside exit door from the parking lot into the building? I don't think there is. The wheelchair can, the person can hit the elevator button.
Mhm.
Is there a button into our office area from the hallway? No, I don't think so. We have a keypad with our code, our card that gives us access, but there's no button pushed on the door if that person is coming in by themselves. So there's two key things, I think, a physical barrier to a handicapped person in the wheelchair coming into the office. The workstations are probably all right,
Mhm.
but it's those two key areas. I think we
Yeah.
should look at.
One of the things, those are great suggestions, and that made me think of one of the things that I'm finding a lot of companies need more, since they are doing a lot more on Zoom and other, virtual platforms, is using the captions, because some people have hearing disabilities, hearing loss. And so they may not always hear the speaker that's speaking very clearly. And so, kind of being aware that different people have different levels of abilities and may need, different things. And again, as we've all been saying, making it okay to say, hey, I'm struggling with this. What can we do? And if it's a simple adjustment, like turning on the captions in Zoom, that doesn't require us to, spend $1 million on new equipment or do anything, really fancy or costly. Just really simple adjustments. But, again, it's got to be okay to say, hey, this is what's going on. And those things change over time. It doesn't always stay the same. What I, valued, and what my priorities, maybe not what I valued, but what my priorities were when I had, kids in the home, and all of the things that go along with that are different now that the nest is empty. So it's just different. I'm not rushing to pick up kids and rushing to school and rushing to this and that. And so the priorities are different. And so just being aware that those do change over time is important as well.
Got a good feeling, isn't it?
It is kind of. I'm used to it now. I'm good. I'm good with it. So yeah, it's, that's just being aware that, someone who just came out of school, in 5 years, they won't be that new grad anymore. So what they are talking about and needing right now will be different in a few years. That new mom won't always be a new mom. So what she'll be talking about and thinking about, later won't be the same. So things happen in our lives. So that makes it important to keep that conversation going and not just assume that because you talked to somebody when they were new with the organization, that what they talked about in terms of their values and preferences, that it's always going to be that way. I think a lot of us learned a lot about ourselves during the pandemic, right? Things that we, just in the, what are they calling it? The Great Resignation, where so many people started to kind of take stock of their lives and realize, I'm working too much. I haven't seen my family. A lot of people that I know and care about are either sick or no longer alive. And I got to make some changes that better reflect the things that are important to me. So we had millions of people leave the workforce. They decided, we'll figure out, we made it through the recession. We'll just figure out how to make it financially. And I'm not going to do this anymore, right? And so just realizing again that those priorities do change over time. So keeping that conversation alive is important. And actually that is going to relate to another activity that we'll do shortly. I like hearing you all talk more than I like hearing me talk. So I'm going to do more of that. But before we do that, we're going to move to, so we've talked about what an inclusive leader is, those 4 phases. We talked about those 5 keystones, like language and prioritizing inclusion, embracing change, all the ones we just talked about. Then we'll move to some mindsets. So you'll see on page 4, 3 key mindsets. And we'll talk about some of the behaviors that go along with each of these mindsets. So you have challenging your perspective. In order to do that, it takes humility, takes self-awareness, and it takes active listening. As I mentioned, once you ask all the questions that we're saying we should ask people, we have to be prepared to listen and be receptive to what we might hear. And of course, a part of asking questions is curiosity. It's weird. There it is, curiosity. Curiosity and empathy. Let's see if I can get back there. Yeah. So the second core is steering towards differences. So we have curiosity, again, those questions and wonders about other people, their culture, their family, their life, their background, and recognizing that we want to keep that conversation going because those things change. Showing empathy, understanding for other people's kind of life experience. So it's really not about you changing their mind about things or them changing your mind about things. It's just being open to a greater understanding. And seeking fairness for all. We'll come back to that one. So we want to talk about some of the things that are involved with the 2 cores, right? Challenging your perspective and steering towards differences. So we said that these are some of the things that are involved. So this is what that might look like, some of the behaviors. When you're showing humility, you're admitting mistakes, you're learning from criticism. So that means you got to be open to feedback. You're seeking out other people's contributions. So that means when you need ideas or a suggestion or to talk through things with someone, you might not always go to the same person. You might say, hey, let me ask him. You see what he might have to share. That might give you some new, different perspectives that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. Being that active listener, we're showing respect for other people when we listen to them. Again, not necessarily telling them that their perspectives are wrong, but just being willing to hear them out. Again, you don't have to change their mind and they don't have to change yours. So that involves just kind of keeping quiet, and letting them talk, letting people share, not interrupting. And then challenging your own assumptions and judgments. I mentioned earlier that, we all have some bias about something, right? And, it could be a bias about brown shoes. Who knows? It could be anything, right? Something that has happened in your life that you think, well, this is good and this is bad and this will be harmful for me and this will be helpful for me. So one of the things that we develop biases about pretty early on is food, right? We decide that this is delicious and we love it forever. And we decide that something else is not and we never want it. Like, no, I don't want those peas. I don't want it. And sometimes that changes over time. Like, oh, I gave it another try and it's not so bad. But we start to develop those very, very early on, and we make decisions, we make judgments about that. So if you've decided that, that raisins are gross, right? If someone gives you a salad that's got raisins in it, then you won't want that, right? Because you've got your mind made up about that. So we just have to be aware of those things, which means being aware of yourself and all the things you bring to the table with you, all the beliefs, maybe even privileges, thoughts, backgrounds, values, and being curious. So we talked a lot about that because that opens you up to see things through someone else's lens, just being open to hearing about, learning about a life experience, someone else's truth, something that is perhaps different than your own. So given all of that, I'll ask you to go to the bottom of page 4. Yeah. And think about which one of those you could improve. And you can think about the core, the big headings, or the bulleted items underneath. Which one of those would you individually think, yeah, I could do better at that. I could be more curious, or I could be a better listener, or I could do better at showing empathy. Again, we didn't talk a whole lot about the things under seeking fairness for all, because that gets us into the topic of advocacy, and we would really need a couple more hours to spend to talk about that. But if you just think about the ones we've looked at, particularly under challenging your perspectives and steering towards differences. So again, it's just a reflection on you and what you think you could do better. Okay, so hopefully you have identified something from the list we looked at that you think you can do better. One of the last pieces we'll look at is exploring what's next, right? So we want to talk about some situations. So there are 2 different scenarios that you'll look at in your packet. And so everything we're talking about really is designed to expand your thinking. Your willingness to listen, your willingness to learn, your willingness to hear different perspectives, your curiosity. One of my mentors calls it listening to be influenced. Listening as if you're going to allow someone to just pour into you like you do when you're watching your favorite TV show or sitting with your favorite person. Like you really want to understand what they're saying. So you're kind of giving your whole self to the situation. So we want to be able to explore that and keep that in the top of our minds. So as we go into this next activity, we'll be talking about that curiosity mindset, exploring those different perspectives and welcoming those differences. Again, as I said, listening to be influenced, that's really the same as leaning into those differences, really allowing a person to speak without judgment or assumption, without interruption, so you can really understand where they're coming from. And maybe that will kind of lead to the question, oh, how can I help support this person? Not if you agree or disagree with how they're living or what their life is like, but just, oh, okay, how can I support them? Can I support them? Is there something I can be saying or doing differently to help them meet or reach their peak performance, right? So we want to be curious. We also want to practice candor, and that's what we'll talk about. We'll talk about curiosity and candor as we get into this step, which is the explore step. So you'll notice on page 5. Oh, there's something else, the 3 questions. So that might be something you can think about how you can use these as we are getting into the scenarios on page 5. In situations where maybe someone is asking for something and you don't understand what they're asking for or why. Maybe there's a disagreement, because those will happen. A difference of opinion or perspective. And there's an opportunity to ask, what am I missing, right? What maybe are other people saying that I'm not saying? What am I saying that maybe others aren't seeing? Because that might mean that others have a blind spot and you need to call it out. Hey, maybe this is something we need to consider. We haven't talked about this. And then what are we all missing or both missing if you're having a one-on-one dialogue with someone? What are we missing? And that can really help open you up to, it helps kind of stave off the judgments and the biases and puts you in the frame of mind where you're, again, more curious, where you are looking to learn. And because we're going to also talk about candor, there's an opportunity for you to share and educate someone else as well. So I mentioned those 2 scenarios. So, oh, let me say that the second one kind of wraps over to page 6. It's 2 lines of it, I think, are at the top of page 6. So if it seems like it's cut off, it is, but the other half of it's there. So I'm going to ask you to work in groups again, but I'm going to group them a little differently. So this time it'll be you 5. They all just need to whip around and y'all be able to do that. Well, the ladies in the back.
No.
I got 5, I got 6. This seems like a pretty big group here. Break you up and have one small. Sir, would you mind working? Thank you. So now we've got groups of 6, I think.
Come on, Wayne.
And so we're putting more minds together just so we have more opportunities to share ideas. So what you're doing is reading through that first scenario. It's also up here on the screen if you'd rather look at that. And then you're talking about what you might say to this individual to be candid and what you might ask the individual to be curious. You don't necessarily have to jump right to solutions or answers or resolutions. Just what can you say to be candid? What do you need to be candid about, right? Straightforward, open about, and what do you need to ask? What do you need to be curious about maybe their situation, their preferences, their needs, etc.
So what is a stretch assignment? What do you mean by that?
Oh, something that would kind of go beyond, thank you for asking that question, something that goes beyond their normal work that might be a little more challenging for them to do than they normally do. Yeah.
I said I think you're right.
I don't even know.
4 hours.
Yeah. If they- it's I mean, it's a simple. Well, I gave you a bunch of tasks.
So it's easy.
It's still like
What do you gotta tell us first?
So this is, someone is telling you, it's like, hey, Kyle, like, why am I being singled out? Oh, just trying to tell us. What?
So that to sit, I'm just trying to get a tape.
I'm always.
You, somebody on your team, Steve, why, coach, that would be a statement. That would be great. What would you? That's what they're asking.
I look at it in your defense.
I don't understand.
Yes, you know, to get this is something else. Why have this? What's going on? That's caused. Why are you?
Especially.
Yeah, I was going down that road and I blew my chain. Calm
No, you can't read.
Well, I mean, I think it's, they're the ones stretching their silence to come out. There's two of us.
You're right with them on one, but it's just, if they are. We're gonna strategize this week.
Really be. Hey, you don't know this. These are really are. And I'll go over there, but like.
It wasn't more about. Yeah, it's like, you didn't need these things. Or maybe because this is you, oh, you but you said, you know, or you specifically said that you don't want to. But now that you see all these other people are getting recognized from doing, maybe you change your mind. It's like, wait. So, change your mind. Sure. You do this. There's something wrong with that.
So, being curious, like, what can we do to help?
So,
Like we do.
We're answering questions. Yeah, I think Beth. Okay, read the next one. Read the next one, and it goes on
This
to the
person,
next.
they're not being involved. There's all their other authorities are.
Well, I would put everybody else.
So you're just skipping higher. That's all this is. Good. You're skipping higher.
I would.
Yeah, so it sounds like
People
you
come there.
skip your drugs. Your drugs.
More, come in their workload. They don't have to do it.
Well, it's a drug.
So for the second one, somebody's coming in and saying this, otherwise the direct line in their phone.
Correct.
So yes, they skip the, you know, what they had, wait for you. You have too much time directly. You got it.
Yeah. I mean, if I have people skipping over, I'd be like, okay, take their issues and go to those other people. With their pattern. Oh, this is the second time. Maybe a different person. Well, I mean, there's like legal leaders. There's management and work. It's not working. Yeah. Or those behaviors and told them they can't do something and they don't want to. So they try to. I mean, identify whether it's or the middle name. So is there, hey, where does the failure? Is this person just, they can't be available? You know, fit whole. You know, you have to be knowing. Who doesn't talk about your child? I mean,
We're doing something here, guys.
We're using you guys.
Oh, okay. Keep going.
Don't be too candid or I'll be candid back. Okay.
They're scared.
That's called shooting up.
I know that it's not.
Skipping over.
I think they're being communication by the managers. And they're probably, I would assume they told them a little bit. Yep. So they're being. Well, the manager's frustrated because you were not working 8 to 5. So you turn it into something. No.
No, I did the same thing. Why do you think that? But still, why do you really believe? That's a deeper. This started by saying, well, those are normal workouts. So you work it out today, the approach of what's
Yeah. Well, believe me, I know. But what's causing that? How we
I didn't even say you had 8 hours.
Well,
You know, well, what you got me, you work 6 a.m. to 4 o'clock.
well, I know, but then that we train this thing. That's exactly right.
Sorry.
Certain times, I do a lot of stuff. They work 2 hours long, so when someone calls me, I should really just get more.
Well, I think it'd be like, you can't.
Should have done the work field, but it's.
But.
There's no work.
Yeah.
But she was a, yeah, that was experience.
I mean, we have a.
For down here.
But, you know, we have a lot more flexible hours. If one day I want to work 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock, great. If I want to work 6 o'clock, 4 o'clock, great. But we're here for work. Certain time
Question. As Link said, it's not getting. So I think that's. I wonder if I'm socially acceptable for.
It's a little. I'm not either.
Well, and I think you also need to talk. Working in the middle, well, and see if they're specifically giving.
Well, I guess that's the overlook part.
Well, and as the higher up. Yeah, apparently that guy. There you go.
That one day.
I'm not.
You said you wanted to speak.
No, I had told you.
Well, we understand. She already had one of those. Did you? Do I need to do that for my next slide? The standards.
And, yeah, our standard rating was all I had on to ask. No. We need to.
Well, we
They're recommendations. I know, I think. But no, that's not.
but other ones,
But like.
like me.
Is
Is that what I need to do?
Well, sure.
I mean, it's 2 weeks. It was supposed to be next week.
Oh, you mean?
No, I did one last week. I did one last week. So it's supposed to be next week, but I'll do Tuesday next one. I saw those in there.
Well.
Right. So what's the number one? See why?
You heard, I'm not repeating it. I said that's what we're
You should be able to read it. Hear
Yes.
and understand.
What this is.
Somebody can pick up the mantle.
So I am eager to hear what you guys came up with. We'll start with this first scenario, when someone comes to you telling you that they feel singled out, they're not getting special projects, so that they can get the recognition that they think they deserve, what would be some of the statements of candor that we might want to make?
Why do you believe this is happening to you?
Okay,
Why do you feel this way?
right. What's happening that's making you think you're singled out?
I'll wait a little bit.
Yeah. What else? What you guys have for that?
I wrote what you said.
That was like 30 minutes.
This is the.
Oh, there you go. Just to be honest about performance and then get a good understanding, like have the conversation. You know, again, for me, and it was said by someone else too, perception versus reality. Is it just how they're feeling, or is it just how, you know, like the, you know, manager or leadership is perceiving the situation? And then discussing, you know, what the cause is and then ways that you can, you know, try to help improve and work as a team to do that.
Good stuff. Thanks, Pat. What did you gentlemen say that we should say in terms of candor or ask to be curious?
Having dialogue for sure about
Mhm.
performance, and then how to fix it from both parties. And then after fixing it or understanding the issues better, then reaching for stretch assignments. Directly asking for them if not being given one.
Yeah, absolutely. So I like that you identified kind of that open dialogue. 'Cause that's really what it's about, right? Because you could certainly say, well, if you get your performance up, you'll get a stretch assignment. And then, you know, that's over. But that's not much of a conversation. So kind of the questions you asked about or that you mentioned about, why do you think that's happening? What's happened that makes you think you're being singled out? One question I would ask is, have you missed deadlines and details? Because being singled out for it doesn't really mean that it's not happening, right? So can we get to the point where we actually acknowledge that, yeah, I've missed a few deadlines and kind of messed up some details, right? Because then we can candidly say that is something that's pretty important and would hold you back from being a person we'd look at for those stretch assignments. And that's kind of where the candor comes in. If this is a problem, we can't give you this. And then we can ask questions about, what can we do? What can you do? What are you willing to do? What needs to change? And it kind of goes back to those questions, those 3 questions I showed you. What am I missing? What are they missing? What are we both missing? What is this person missing about their performance that they may not realize? They may have their blinders on. What am I missing? Or what is if you're their boss or not, what am I missing that, you know, that I need to know about their strengths or what they perceive their performance to be? So what about that second scenario? What were your thoughts? What were your thoughts about how we might address this if someone comes to you and says, these work hours are just not working, this 40-hour week, it's not working? How might you use candor or curiosity?
That's it all on me.
Tossing the baton to you.
It was something along the lines, you know, like we do have certain standards or expectations, you know, you do have to meet the requirements. For us, you know, sometimes it's really about team collaboration when we have deadlines or client meetings. You know, but also having the conversation, you know, like what challenges are you facing that are preventing you from being able to do these hours? You know, well, maybe there's some type of compromise, you know, for flexibility, because that makes, you know, benefits all parties.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's good though.
It is, isn't it?
She did that all this time.
Other ideas from either of you groups?
The first thing is having a discussion about how long has it been that you haven't gotten a response?
Yesterday?
Yes.
I love that.
That's, you know, that's a critical one.
Because if it's only been an hour.
There you go. Getting, yep. Getting down to the brass
The
tacks.
other discussion after you get through that is one more. Now, what was your understanding when you were hired? What was your
Love it.
job description? And what has changed? since
What
you
has
that
changed?
may have made these issues? And what is the amount of time that they're talking about that is unrealistic?
Right. Yeah, because it sounds like you're getting them to the point where they might acknowledge that it's not the work expectation that's changed, it's their own life situation that's changed. So as we've been talking about, welcoming them to say, right, I've got a sick kid, I've got an elderly parent I'm taking care of, we are down to, one car, and I'm dropping my spouse off at work in the morning, whatever it is. What has changed, as you said, to make this realistic? And then, like, as you also acknowledged, just those minor details. When did you reach out to the sales manager? How long has it been? Well, let's wait another day and see if he gets back to you, because that's really the person you need to talk to about it. And those kinds of things. Did you guys have anything different?
Oh, we
additional?
didn't do that.
Oh, okay.
We thought we were gonna do the first one, and then we'll talk about it, and then we
That's right.
gather up again.
That's my fault. That's my fault. I didn't make that clear. It's my fault. Well, I think your counterparts have nicely covered it, so that is okay.
But one of the things that we need to talk about a little bit is people working from home, because in our profession, mentoring is huge.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get that experience, but also finding out what's changed in their life. We had a lady at work for us. She had a divorce,
Mm-hmm.
but she would maintain custody of her son. So she had to leave the office every day at 3:30.
Mm-hmm.
But she would go home. She didn't want to be a latchkey child. She'd go
Mhm.
home, let him in, fix him a sandwich, and she'd come back to the office and work about 6. But
Wow.
people resented that because she left at 3:30. She's got to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe it's a bigger conversation about what's reasonable in terms of flexibility, whether or not flex hours and flex time is okay, whether or not that's reasonable, core hours that need to be covered, and how big the adjustment is that we're talking about. So if the expectation is 8 to 5, are they talking about an adjustment from 8 to 4:30? That's 30 minutes. Where can we adjust elsewhere? They could take it off their lunchtime. They could, add it on, to each day, or at the end of the week, or whatever seems reasonable, right? So just figuring out how much of an adjustment would really need to be made, and is that reasonable? And also, is it fair to everyone else, who doesn't have that flexibility? Because if you're saying that you're willing to be flexible for one, then you might need to be flexible for others. Because while, like you said, Steve, like a child that needs to be picked up from school is of paramount importance to that individual, my sick parent who I need to get home to and give medicine is of paramount importance to me. So those are different things, but the value is still there. So we have to kind of consider that everybody's situation won't be the same, but it doesn't mean they don't have a situation to be considered, and how much is going to be reasonable to bend or break. But the most important thing that I think you all have identified is just having the conversation. Maybe the answer won't come out right then in the conversation in either one of these scenarios. Maybe you're not agreeing to do anything, but just having that dialogue. Maybe it's something that you can then talk about, to other people. Like, hey, this is happening more and more often. More and more people seem to be struggling with this. We need to talk about it. We need to, consider whether or not we should embrace change or do something a little differently to help our people function better. And then, we start to look at performance and make sure that it's still what we need it to be when people are working these kind of different hours and such. But just, kind of having that conversation. So the last thing I'll ask you to do, which will be on that last page, is your reflection. Any next steps that you want to take? And if there are any like questions or concerns you need to bring higher up in the organization, what are those? Any ideas that you might have about something you could do better, or something your team could do better, or something the whole organization could do better? So any of those, reflections, you'll jot them down there. I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Yeah, a couple of minutes, that's all we have. Does anyone have an idea, suggestion, or next step you'd like to share? Or I'll share it once. It's okay.
Well, effective communication. Listening and then responding. If they're working together to solve a problem.
Together. Yep. Which makes me think you don't always have to have the right answer, right? You don't always have to have an instant answer. Have that open dialogue and be willing to solve it together. You don't know what may be the best for that other person. Just talking about it.
Self-awareness, just knowing what you're saying, like understanding what, like the words that you're, even if it's a word that you use constantly over and over, understanding that it could be offensive or it could mean something to someone else. I think just trying to train yourself to understand and think that way is like next step.
Yeah. Yeah, just kind of knowing that it has a different meaning. It could have a different meaning to someone else based on their culture, background, life experience, or whatever. It could have a different meaning than what you intend. Anything else? Well, I thank you guys for your time and attention, your participation, just allowing me to be here. And hopefully I'll see you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And thanks to you guys on the phone too.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Who's on the phone?
Uh,